Shalom and welcome to Jewish Insights. We are currently at that special time of year, right after the holiday of Simchat Torah, of celebrating completing and beginning of the Torah, where we reflect on the Torah we've learned in the past year and we begin the journey of learning the Torah anew in the coming year. We recently read the first story of the Torah, the story of Breshit, and then we're transitioning into the story of Noach. And it's this time of year, as I mentioned in the past, where you kind of decide what's your Seder, what's the plan for yourself for Torah study this year. And so people pick up individual books. Maybe they learn a commentary on the Torah. Maybe they pick up a bedside book that has stories about the Torah. But it's a time for each of us to consider, how are we going to interact with the Torah, with the Parshas this year? And alongside that, a second question we think about this time of year is, who are we going to study it with? Who's going to be our chavruta? Who's going to be our partner, the person that we study it with? And recently we had the band Distant Cousins here on Jewish Insights, and David Swirsky, one of the members of the band, said something that really has stuck with me since he said it. He said that often young people approach him and they say to him, I'm struggling to put together a band. Everyone who I meet isn't into the same music as me or isn't similar to me, and we can't get a band going. And he always gives the same advice to them, which is as follows. He says to them, find someone different than you. If you want to make amazing music, find someone with different musical tastes, with different musical goals, and when you come together, it'll make amazing music. So today we're going to celebrate some amazing music that was made in the space of Torah. We're celebrating the publication of this book, It Takes Two to Torah. An Orthodox rabbi and Reformed journalist discuss and debate their way through the 5 books of Moses. And it's a series of 10-minute conversations between my guests today, one for each Torah portion. So if you're looking for a way to kind of make your way through the Torah portions week after week, this is a really accessible, interesting, lively way to make it through it. And it's extra exciting because the authors of this book are 2 close friends, 2 people I've learned a ton from in my life that I'm thrilled to have in the studio. The first is Abigail Pogrebin, who, as you know, is the host of In the Spotlight, which premieres at 8 o'clock on Monday evenings, one of our flagship shows that we're so proud of here. She is the author of My Jewish Year, 18 Holidays, One Wondering Jew, which was a National Jewish Book Award finalist. She's also the author of Stars of David, Prominent Jews Talk About Being Jewish. Everyone's in there. It's an amazing book. She's written for The Atlantic, The Forward, and The Tablet. And in addition to In the Spotlight, you've seen her moderate tons of conversations at other times on JBS, including the conversation she moderates for the Stryker Center. In addition to Abby, which is so exciting to have you, we have Rabbi Dov Linzer, who is the president and Rosh HaYeshiva, rabbinic head of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, an Orthodox rabbinical school and Torah center, which promotes a more open and exclusive orthodoxy, and as you know, is where I received my rabbinic ordination. He, along with Rabbi Avi Weiss, pioneered an amazing rabbinical school and approach to rabbinic education, which I think has not only influenced the people in that world, but has really spread out and influenced people from all the way to the right, all the way to the left, how they think about how to train rabbis. And so we're thrilled to have him. He's also written extensively for The Forward, for The Tablet, and The New York Times. He's been published widely, and he's hosted highly popular Torah podcasts. So thank you both for being here.
So good to be here. Are we done?
Yeah.
What an introduction.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's
wonderful.
wonderful
So good to be with you,
Yeah.
Justin. We're Rabbi Pines. We're big fans.
Thank you. So thank you. I know you guys are kind of on a bit of a world tour right now. You're on Good Morning America. You're running around. Everyone wants a piece of the action here.
There's nothing like JBS.
There's nothing like JBS.
It's like
That's
coming
right.
home.
It's right. It's good to have you home. Exactly. So let's just start. I know, Abby, a lot of our audience knows you, but let's do it again. I think let's just start a little bit around understanding, the type of people you are in your Jewish journey that brought you to this moment. So Abby, I'll start with you. I know, you were producing, for 60 Minutes,
Yes.
winning Emmy Awards, and now you at some
Nominated,
point
I never won.
Sorry. In my book, you deserve to win.
Thank you, Justin.
There you go. How do you end up? How does your journey bring you towards these different books about the Jewish journey?
Yes. I think my journey is a little more winding than Dov's, but I will just try to summarize it on one foot. My mother, Letty Pogrebin, who some of the viewers know, was raised in a very conservative home in Queens, Jamaica, Queens. She was really
Jewish conservative, you mean?
Jewish conservative.
Not politically
Sorry,
conservative.
Jewish conservative. Thank you for articulating that, clarifying that. Her father was president of the shul, which was a big deal. He didn't have a son, so he raised my mom kind of as the son he never had, Jewishly. She had a very rigorous Jewish education. And then she had a shattering experience when she was 15 years old. Her mother died of cancer very suddenly. And even though my mother knew Kaddish by heart and felt not just proud, but really needing that liturgy at that moment, she was excluded from reciting it, obviously, because of the minyan did not require women. And they essentially went out and got a stranger to complete it. And that was just such a shattering moment for her that it took her a long time to come back back. And so fast forward, she becomes a parent, and she raises my twin sister, Robin, and my brother, David, and I, and we don't get a formal Jewish education. We had home-based Judaism. We had an incredible Hanukkah party that is like a show in and of itself. If someday I'll describe it. We did celebrate Shabbat when we were home, and we went to the high holidays, but we didn't belong to a synagogue in the formal sense. So I really missed the scaffolding, I would say, of a Jewish education. That began to bother me. When I went to college, I went to Yale. There was a wonderful Hebrew teacher there, Miri Kabovi, who was Israeli. She taught us Hebrew vocabulary using the Israeli top 40. That's how I was very, very cool when I came out in 1987, and it's all very dated now in terms of my Hebrew. But then I had my first son, Benjamin, and we had the bris, and I was suddenly asking myself, how are you going to explain this, what you're passing on? You really have never kind of taken the time to understand your heritage and decide whether it's meaningful to you, let alone whether you can translate it for this generation that you're not now responsible for. And meanwhile, journalistically, I started to interview famous Jews about their Jewish identity. I think it was my backdoor way of exploring what I'd never asked myself. That's the book you described, Stars of David. Sure. I interviewed everyone from Ruth Bader Ginsburg to Steven Spielberg about whether they cared about their inheritance, how they raised their kids. But simultaneously, I studied Torah. I thought I would need to catch up. I thought that these celebrities would actually know more than I did, and that was kind of an easy layup because I knew so little. It turned out not to be so much the case. But as you know, Justin, I just became kind of alive with Jewish study. I really became kind of an addict. I started not just to read Torah with this wonderful rabbi, but to kind of be that person in the back at JTS auditing classes and the same at Hadar. And it led me to my second book about the Jewish holidays. I think I was a wandering Jew, sort of flailing but finding meaning in this incredible tradition and these texts in ways I hadn't expected. I joined Central Synagogue in 2006. It's a Reform synagogue. Angela Buchdahl is the rabbi.
We're very familiar with our Friday night and Saturday services with Central Synagogue, for sure. Keep going.
And this is what brings us to here, which is that I knew there was something really big missing. And in the meantime, I had met Rabbi Dov Linzer, we can talk about how. And it was really because of our back and forth, sharing our work, sharing our projects. Kind of there was Torah in all of it. As you know, it shows up for everything. And it was really his idea to say, you know what, we should talk about this foundational book out loud, unrehearsed, 10 minutes per parsha. Let's bring our chevruta across really deep lines of difference to other people, invite them in. But I want to be really clear. I feel like I have deep Judaism, but I do not fast 6 times a year, sure. And I fast once, and Dov does, and I don't speak Hebrew fluently. It takes me a long time to read anything, sure. And we know that Dov is master. I have read the Torah once until this conversation, and frankly, I don't feel like halakha, Jewish law, binds me in the way that it does Dov. So we really came at this really from very different perspectives, though I don't want to sort of minimize what it means to be a Reformed Jew.
Beautiful. I have a million.
Sorry, I didn't take a breath.
That's fine. No need to breathe.
Very impressive.
Dov is used to that.
Exactly. I know. It's actually when you read the conversation between you guys, it's amazing because I can hear your voices going back and forth.
I do let Dov speak sometimes.
Yeah.
You see, Justin, you might remember from rabbinical school where I would talk a mile a minute, and there was actually one student who tried to play me back at like half speed, but I think I'm being outdone. So.
Right, exactly. We're a group of fast speakers here. So, Rabbi Linzer, before I go to you, I want to ask just a couple follow-ups.
Sure.
So first, I wanted to ask, coming full circle, I know this was a hard year. Your father passed, Abby,
Thank you.
And sorry for your loss again. And I had the merit to join you at the funeral there. I just, thinking back to your mother's experience and losing her mother and the Kaddish, and now kind of you're going through a year of mourning for your father, and she's going through a year of mourning for her husband. Kind of. How's that going?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for mentioning. Nobody really has. And this is one of the examples where the Jewish community has shown up in a way that reminds me why we have the kind of infrastructure around mourning and grief. It holds you. You were there. People from all through my life were there. It gets me choked up just remembering kind of who walked in the door of that shiva. And that's really what I'm holding. My mother was, in a way, extremely observant, despite the fact that she had this very difficult moment, and she came back to her faith and her observance much more rigorously the way she was raised. My father never had it and never returned to it. He would go to synagogue because she said, please come with me twice a year. Sure. But he was really what we call that bagel and lox Jew who was really kind of guided by social justice more than anything. Instead of kind of honoring my father through rituals that really didn't speak to him, I've tried to, in a sense, have an ongoing conversation with him, which is what I think he appreciated about about Jewish inheritance, honestly.
So beautiful. And I'll just say it really echoes, this idea of making the Judaism yours in some way, which I hear in your whole narrative, which is kind of saying this thing was a little bit taken away from me because there was a moment that didn't go well for my mother, and now I had this opportunity to enter it on my terms and find its meaning. And it's not about checking box, do I fast this many times a year, but there's a sense of ownership that says, okay, there's a theory to think about how to honor one's loved one who passed. How do I enter into that and build some practice?
Beautiful.
Okay, beautiful. All right.
Thank you.
Of course, thank you. Rabbi Linzer. Okay, tell me a little bit. How do you become Rabbi Linzer, Rabbi Linzer?
I think my story is quite different than Abby's. If Abby's was more one of like a little circuitous and growth, mine I think was maybe more one of starting very narrow and deep and then opening up. So when I was already a teenager, I really took to the study of Talmud, which is the most difficult, intellectually demanding, complex, enormous in scope of Jewish tradition and of Jewish text and learning.
This is in Yeshiva.
This is when I was in high school.
Maryland?
In Maryland.
Great.
I grew up in a modern Orthodox family, in a modern Orthodox community, but the teachers were more from the yeshivish world, from the sort of right-wing world and not the modern Orthodox world. And they impressed on me the primacy of Talmud Torah, of Torah study, and I really absorbed those messages very deeply. Like the best and most important thing you can be doing with your life is spending all your time sitting and learning Torah.
Right. I want to pause you one thing, just to clarify some terms for us also. So, Abby talked about Torah and reading the Torah for the first time. When we say Torah, we mean the 5 books of Moses. And you're referencing now not a high school experience where you're studying Breshit and Noah every day, but a high school experience where you're studying
Talmud. There are 24 tractates of Talmud, and it takes people who learn 1 page a day 7.5 years to go through it. And even studying 1 page a day takes most people about an hour. So we are not talking about reading a long book. We are talking about an extremely demanding text.
Right. And also to clarify, comfortably interrupting my Rosh
Please,
Yeshiva.
please.
So another things I just want to highlight for our audience here is, this is the Oral Torah. This is the rabbinic discussion about kind of what's written in the Torah. It's a lot more. There are stories, but it's much more legal. Whereas the 5 books of Torah are much more story oriented. And already there's kind of, let's just note that difference in terms of thinking about what's primal, what's important, right? Which is like spending each week studying the weekly Torah portion versus like, I would say, I don't want to paint broad strokes, but in some ways, maybe in the more Orthodox world, Torah is almost kind of seen as like over here, and Talmud, like the rabbi's discussion about the Torah, that's where it's at.
I think that's that. Yeah. So actually, let me interrupt my story for a minute just to respond to that, because it's true. The Talmud is an enterprise that began about 200 before the Common Era and went till about 600 after, and it's the rabbis interpreting mostly the laws of the Torah. It is the source of Jewish halacha, of the entire legal tradition, and how it gets translated into all of these tiny details. There is some narrative, there is some sort of broader Jewish thought in there, but most of it is the detailed study of halakha. And in a way, it's almost the mirror image of the Torah. The Torah is mostly narrative, but of course there are sections that are very dense with mitzvot, with divine commandments, with what becomes Jewish law. The Talmud is mostly the law and some of the narrative. And I think that one of the things that gets lost by focusing on the primacy of Talmud study is that God often is not part of the conversation. It's like halacha is what defines being an Orthodox Jew. And this type of study of halacha and the observance of halacha, and God, you would be shocked how rarely God is mentioned from the pulpit. I would sometimes say to our students, we teach rabbinical students, I said, I think the only word that is less common to hear from an modern Orthodox pulpit than God is sin. So, which is also interesting. Wow. Modern Orthodox community, they don't talk about sin as much as they might in a different community, but God is really not part of the conversation. And there's even a statement in the Talmud that says somebody who studies the Torah, sort of the small version of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, there's value in that. But somebody who studies Talmud, there is nothing that is as valuable as that. Right. So that is certainly absolutely the message of traditional Orthodox Judaism. And but as I said, there's something we really sacrifice. Right. I would say it's the religiosity. We're good in terms of the halacha and the detail, but thinking about God and thinking about narratives and stories and how are we living our lives and the values, that really, there's a lot of correction that needs to get done there.
Beautiful. So you're deep in that. You're in high school in
I'm
Maryland,
deep in that.
And Torah was like in 3rd grade or something. You're like, it's Talmud, Talmud, Talmud.
Right,
all the time.
Talmud,
Great.
all the time,
Right.
exactly.
And you loved it, or they impressed upon you? Use interesting language.
It was the perfect sort of confluence, that they were telling me this is the most important thing to do, and I loved it. I enjoyed the intellectual sort of deliberations and immersing myself in it. And by the time I was in high school, I was spending every free minute studying Talmud, I don't know, 10 hours a day. Maybe that's a little exaggeration, 6 hours a day. And also, even when I would leave my study, I would constantly be thinking in my head and going over the arguments. And it was more than once that I was closing my eyes as I was walking home and going over the arguments that I would walk into a telephone pole.
I'm sure that doesn't surprise you, no.
So I tell this story in the introduction to our book. And that I think is a perfect metaphor for how a lot of my life had been. My early life was a deep, very blinders on, narrow, going extremely deep, but not seeing everything that was in front of me. Sure. I would say that I remember even as a young man, even when I was still in high school, that I was more receptive to certain new movements than other people in the community. Particularly at that time was when Orthodox feminism was just beginning, within the Jewish community. And there were a lot of people who were saying, oh, these women, they want to destroy the tradition, and they're coming with, all of these outside agendas. And my feeling was, here are people that want to participate more, want to be more empowered, want to connect to the tradition, and we should be receptive to that, and we should be responsive to that. So I think that type of responsiveness and sensitivity to where people were coming from was always there, but my focus still had just really been the intellectual study of the Talmud. And that was for many years afterwards. I spent many years in Israel studying in Yeshivot there. You mentioned Gush Etzion, which was the yeshiva that I was in Israel. And then I was really, when I was in Israel, I was getting like 6 hours of sleep a night and 18 hours of Talmud study. And I'll just tell you one little thing just to give you a sense of how crazy I was at that time. I don't know if you know this. I would be sitting in the base medrash, the study hall, and I would need to stay awake because I was pushing myself. And I didn't have the time to go and make myself a cup of coffee, so I would just chew coffee grinds.
Oh my God, Dov.
So I just want to show you that
the audience is getting a picture.
That gives you the sense of the type of, you can do that when you're a young person, a young man, be just totally focused and extreme. But part of the thing that allowed that was that I really pushed a lot of things out. For a while, I pursued some other pursuits. I always remained observant. I was always studying Torah, but I was a computer programmer for a few years. You might know that about me. I don't know if you do. Anyway, but then I said, look, I really have to get myself back to the world of Torah. And I went back and I started, again, I already had rabbinic ordination by that point. I had a rabbinic ordination at a very young age, 22. And then I headed up a kollel in Boca Raton, Florida. And I think...
A kollel is a place where people...
thank you. Yes.
You define it.
Okay, well, there are different meanings, but what this was is it was a group of like 4 rabbis that would spend half the day. Kollel usually is people of advanced study, advanced background, that are spending the whole day sitting and learning. Mm-hmm. But here it was a community kollel, so they spent half the day in traditional Talmudic study and half the day giving classes in community. And I was heading this up, and this was in Boca Raton, Florida. And I think this was the next step in my broadening of my aperture, and because part of this was going out and teaching in the community. And I remember very clearly one time I was doing a lunch and learn in some businessman's office, and this person, was not coming from a traditional background. And the parsha of the week was Bamidbar, which is Numbers. And that is a very hard parsha to find meaning in. A lot of it is about how the camps were arranged, all the numbers of Jews that were in this tribe and that tribe. Abby in the book actually said, maybe it's called Numbers because it's so numbing.
I've said smarter things than that.
That's a great line.
It is a great line. Num even has the B from Numbers. Yeah, anyway. Anyway, so I tried to say something, and I was saying, it's interesting. The Torah uses different words for describing the directions, north, east, south, and west. One sort of refers to how a person is standing. The other refers to where the sun is in the sky. And I'm finding this intellectually fascinating. And this guy says, Rabbi, what does this have to do with my life? And it was such a basic question, but I never really, that wasn't how I studied text. The text I studied was all interesting because of the intellectual ideas and the way it spoke to other text, not the way it was speaking to our life. And the next stage really came when Avi Weiss, this was 25 years ago, decided to start a new rabbinical school. And a rabbinical school that was, as you mentioned, really stood out in terms of its training of rabbis and understood how important being a rabbi is being present for people. Pastoral counseling was something we really introduced in a major way to rabbinic training, and it's still really the jewel of our crown, I would say. And training people professionally for the rabbinate, because in the Orthodox community, it was basically, if you know a lot of text, you can be a rabbi, sort of what my story had been. And this was, no, actually, you need to learn the skills, and you need to learn how do you lead community. But the other thing that it was about, the reason that it was important to train rabbis was because it was about a different type of an orthodoxy that was much more open and inclusive, and gets back to something Abby said about her mother. At that time, the women's issues within Orthodoxy were the burning issues. That was when some other organizations like JOFA, Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, got started. Drisha, which was a higher learning for, a Talmud learning for women. And in the synagogue, the ability for women to say Kaddish, right? The roles that women could play within the synagogue, it was very rare to find that in an Orthodox synagogue. And that's just one example. An Orthodoxy that's much more open in thought, open
Yeah, but just to be clear, YCT
is Orthodox. So right, the women
it's
and
only
women.
for men.
Okay, so we'll get back to that if you want me to.
But you're describing it as if.
But no. So let me be clear. It was a rabbinical school for men because at that stage, right, a woman Orthodox rabbi was taboo and off the table, even for YCT. But it was about creating communities and Orthodox communities and synagogues, which gave a much greater role for women. And even till today, people who want an Orthodox synagogue that has greater roles for women in leadership and ritual in the synagogue space, they will look for a synagogue headed by a YCT rabbi. That's really very distinctive about us. But it wasn't just limited to the women's issues. It was a much more open and inclusive Orthodoxy. The point I thought you were going to make, Abby, which is a point you've made before also, is it's still Orthodoxy. There still is a mechitza, the divider. Men and women are separate. There are some areas of halacha where we remain very traditional because we feel that that's what halacha demands. Sure. But it was really as open of an Orthodoxy you could be while being seriously committed to Orthodoxy and halacha, which we are. So that also really inspired me, this broad, more open view. But even so, I came on as the Rosh HaYeshiva, which is the rabbinic head. I headed the studies, all of the Talmud study. And so my world didn't really leave the academy that much. It was still all about texts and ideas, and it was the rabbis we produced. They went out and they translated that into the real world. I would like to think, Justin, that everything that you are doing here is taking Torah and translating the tradition in ways that are accessible and meaningful and speak to the real world. But I still wasn't doing that so much, and I think that the next real shift happened 5 years ago when I became president. Because becoming president means really representing the institution to the broader world and having those larger conversations. And it was at that time that Abby and I think I suggested to Abby, I don't know if I was consciously thinking of this, but I think my orientation was broadening, and I said, hey, we should bring our Torah conversations out into the broader world, and that began the podcast.
Beautiful. All right, I have one small follow-up question, and then I want to get into it. I'm going to indulge. It's a rumor that used to go around Yeshiva, talking about the ways that you accelerated through your learnings, was that at the University of Maryland, there was some sort of, I don't know if they call it the Rabbi Linzer rule, but a rule that was created because of you.
Yeah.
Because you finished school very quickly. Just give us what happened there.
Yeah, I did college in a year. So,
you did college in a year?
Yeah, at the University of Maryland. They had a limit to how many credits you could take a semester, but if you had you could get special dispensation and get that waived, and I did, and then they had no limit after that. So So I finished college in a year, and some of it came through taking certain tests in the Hebrew department and the Judaic Studies department. So then there became this unofficial Linzer rule that limited the amount of those types of credits that students could take going forward.
Amazing.
Nobody can do that anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Rabbi by 22, college in 1 year. Okay, amazing. Okay, so you guys, you had an existing relationship and started this?
So basically we met at a conference.
Okay.
That doesn't sound exciting, but it actually was a pretty exciting conference. It was called The Conversation, very appropriately.
Of course.
It was convened by the Jewish Week, and appropriate because they really encouraged us all to talk. You know, there were non-for-profit heads, the head of organizations, clergy, writers, and it was basically like, what's on your mind, what's keeping you up at night? And it was off the record, so nobody could feel like anything was going to end up in the newspaper. And Dov and I kept kind of ending up in the same kind of study groups and breakout sessions, and, you know, sparred, but also really respected each other's opinions, and we stayed in touch. And when I would have a project, like I was working on the book about Jewish holidays, I was interviewing over 60 rabbis and scholars to understand the entire blueprint of the Jewish year, which, as you know, kind of is bottomless. And I turned to Dov for help, and he was extremely generous in kind of being my chavruta there. He was writing an op-ed for the New York Times. I'll just point out he's been in the Times and I have not. So I helped him with that.
We're working at correcting that.
It was just back and forth for years, and so the chavruta existed in the sense that when I say we always came back to Torah, that sounds almost like, you know, some kind of highfalutin idea, but you know these are sort of the foundational questions, and we would push each other, and that the differences in a way were why it was more interesting. I think Dov and I have gotten a real friendship, but we're not the same person, and I would even say that we don't know a ton about each other's personal lives, to be honest with you. So there's kind of like the intimacy is in the learning, is in the talking. I say intimacy, not like
We get it.
misusing that word. But I think that's where, you know, Havruta takes you. Obviously, he could have been more, frankly, judgmental about studying with me. Let's just put that on the table. It's not what every Orthodox rabbi might think to do. But then when we started this conversation, we brought it to Tablet Magazine and asked if they'd consider it to be a podcast, and they said yes. And everyone really loved it who listened to it, but they often couldn't keep up with it and said, I wish this existed on the page. I wish I could go back to these parshiot and see these conversations, and I wish it existed, you know, from basically the beginning of Genesis to the end of Deuteronomy in one place between two book covers, so that I could have my own conversation with someone in one place on the page, and that's the way it exists.
Amazing. And it's a great idea to even imagine. You have it in the tagline, the Orthodox rabbi and the Reformed journalist, which is like an interesting. And both of you, like you said, it's atypical roles, right? So you imagine the Orthodox rabbi as kind of like teaching, like you're a Rosh HaYeshiva, you're often in front of the room. You know, I've been in that room. I've been in that room learning.
It's
you know,
scary. I hear it's a scary
exactly.
room.
I think it's a challenge to keep up, but it's amazing what Rabbi Linzer is doing in the room, and I feel very grateful to have been in that room. And then you, Abby, on the other hand, are usually in the question-asking space, right?
And I still was. Like,
right.
I just want to be honest. Like, we had real conversations, but it was often jump-started by my questions, and I was asking as a journalist, but really asking as a Jew, and it was amazing to sit with someone who was basically memorized the document from when he was in utero, and be able to say, you know, this isn't making sense to me, you know, and then Dov was really, I think, not just like, you know, tzimtzum, as we say, like leaving space for me, but really curious about where I was coming at things, because I kept bringing it back to like, why does this matter now? You know, we did this between 2018 and 2020. You know, there was the travel ban from the current administration there, huge arguments about immigration. The COVID pandemic was going on. We can talk about all the parshiot that speak to contagion and disease.
Sure.
And there was the racial reckoning in the United States after George Floyd's murder. Like, the Torah rises up to meet you wherever you are.
Right.
So, yeah.
If there's one takeaway, we should remind our audience that like it's whatever year it is, the Torah is there to speak to you, and having someone to study with it adds value certainly. That's super interesting. Okay, so tell me a little bit, like, you know, I've read several of these now. How did you guys prepare for this? Is it the type of thing, because you jump right in? It's amazing. So what was that process like?
Trying to remember, I think mostly Abby and I would get on the phone and we would say, okay, what do we think is interesting in this parsha? Because we had decided to pick just one topic within the parsha.
Right.
And we would throw around a couple of ideas. And again, sometimes it would be a recap of that story I said, where I think something is fascinating, and Abby's like, this is so not relevant to our lives. this was all part of my growth and my opening
And
up.
sometimes he would say, wait a second, take a second look at that.
Right.
And it would be more interesting than I thought, or
Right.
more kind of rich than I had thought.
Right. So then we landed on something and said, oh yeah, this has a lot of potential, and we could talk about the following themes. We did not prepare our words, but we identified the themes we wanted to talk about, and then Abby, I think you would go and you would do some of your own research and study, so you came with.
I certainly was kind of behind the eight ball in terms of that, but I approached it almost like as a news story, and it took a deep dive.
So there was space between those two conversations.
There was space.
Pick the topic, and then you meet at a later, like a week later or something like that.
In person.
And then you do
and sometimes we would record more than one parsha in that sitting, so we would have had a longer conversation yelling from my kitchen and wherever Dov was, and then we would go into the studio, and it really was very real time. We usually recorded for 20 minutes, and they edited it down to 10.
Beautiful. Okay, fine. All right, so let's do it live. We just, and I know you haven't had the chance to do the preparing, but let's ask on the spot a little bit. So I mentioned, this will play at other times of the year, but certainly right now we're at the time of year where we're thinking about the beginnings of the Torah. We just, this past a couple days ago, read the story of Breshit, the opening story. What are the themes that come up for you guys? Make your magic live. I have the musicians play their songs. You guys do your thing. Talk to me about Genesis.
Because we really weren't prepared for this.
100%.
I want to tell everybody.
There was no prep.
But I just remember the two creation stories, and that we really talked about why there are two, and that what is the symbolism of the way that the woman appears, the way that Eve appears in each. And I thought it was very significant that the first story is the first, that there's kind of the simultaneity. Why don't you explain the two?
Yeah, let's scaffold. What are the two creation
In the
stories?
first chapter of Breshit, when the 6 days of creation.
Right.
So it just says very simply, God created the man or Adam, the human, in God's image. In the image of God, God created the man or Adam, the human, male and female. God created them.
That's day 6 of creation,
That's
and the
day
famous
6.
7-day creation story.
And that's the
It's like-
first take.
Exactly. God blowing the spirit of the divine into the human being created in the divine image, and male and female created equally at the same time, but no detail.
Sure.
And then the second chapter is the Garden of Eden story, that Adam was all alone in the Garden of Eden. He named all the animals. There's a sense that he was trying to find a mate, but nobody could not find any mate. God made Adam fall asleep, the male, right? And then God took a side, sometimes translated as a rib, of Adam, made that into a female. And then when Adam saw Eve, she wasn't called Eve yet, saw the woman, he said, oh, finally, this is flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones. This will be called woman because she was taken from man. Actually, in English and in Hebrew, those words are very similar. And then the text speaks about, and therefore, man and woman should come together, leave their family, cleave to one another, and become one flesh again, as they originally were. Okay, so that is a very different story. It's a different story about sort of society, but it's also a different story about whether man and woman start equal and at the same time.
And remind me why the
one
rabbis did that. Believe that happened, that there were two.
Well, there are those two stories. Those are just. But the rabbis want to recognize. Yeah, go ahead.
Remind me, Dov, of why the rabbis. That's the traditional reading of why there should be two iterations of essentially the same moment.
Yeah. So. For the most part, they don't address that and say, oh, look, there are two different stories, because the question is, well, wait a minute, what happened, right? They're not taking these as metaphors. They're taking these as extremely literal accounts, historical accounts of what happened. So they can't be in opposition. So there's a desire to read them as a way of harmonizing and reading them together. So the first version was the big overview, the one-sentence summary. Here's the details of what happened. That's how they read it.
Okay.
And what's the kind of the tradition? I know there's many traditional takeaways. But what's the traditional takeaway about? You mentioned loneliness and God. What's your approach there?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of pieces to that, but I would say, in terms of this issue that I think is really Abby is focusing on, the male and female. There's no question that text, the second chapter, has been used to justify the subjugation of women as not as important as man. Women are only there to be man's helpmate, right? And if you just had the first chapter, male and female, God created them. So
that equality just felt important.
Because we started with a man.
Because we
start with a man, woman comes later.
Right.
Obviously, man is this compared to this. With
right, exactly.
I think the other piece was, you just mentioned, was aloneness. This idea that is not good for for a man to be alone. And I just feel like that sense of companionship is, as a kind of directive and ultimate value, is so powerful to me, and obviously plays out in our lives. But just the idea that the Torah knows that, and God sees that from the start, I think is just something that it also speaks to what Dov and I were doing, which is that I don't think it's good to learn alone. I don't think it's good to observe Judaism alone. I feel like all of this comes alive and ultimately is more indelible and more meaningful in companionship and in conversation and in togetherness. And so that, I just remember that as a huge kind of moment for me.
Right, and this was also where Abby sort of opened the text more broadly for me, because I always understood it specifically to be talking about marriage, or the physical coming together of man and woman. If they were one flesh, they come together again as one flesh, referring to the sexual act, and there is actually ways in which that is understood to be referring to giving very positive value to the meaning of sex, within the Jewish tradition. It brings man and woman together in the most intimate way. It's also heterosexual, of course, and that's an issue nowadays. But I always read it very much in that husband, wife, man, woman coming together. And Abby really focused rightly on the broader message of loneliness, which
it's its own, especially today.
Its own thing, and especially post-October 7th, Jews have been feeling so alone and lonely and abandoned, in the States, people that they thought were their friends, and we really, the recognizing loneliness and being there for one another is so critical.
Wow, great. So I want to go two different ways, but let's pick up what you just said for a second. The idea of not only being alone in a marriage, let's say, but you lifted up, Abby, just now, the idea of like studying Torah with someone else. Let's dwell a couple of minutes. You guys each had this special opportunity. I know you've said it before. I'll have you tell each other instead of telling me. What was special about learning with the other person? You can go.
You want me to look at Dov?
Or you can tell me. It doesn't have to be.
It's too
it's easier. So you tell me. I'll be the therapist.
I think it honestly was, and this I hesitate to say it because not everybody is going to sit and talk to this Rosh HaYeshiva. Yeah. But it was just magical to be able to sit with someone who not only has the breadth and the depth of knowledge that Dov does, and we should say that he is considered an authority on halakha in the modern Orthodox community, but that I could kind of ask him anything. Like, you just don't get to kick the tires on this tradition and this text that readily, that easily, with somebody who has spent so much time with it. So it wasn't just like, Dov, explain this to me, I don't like it. It was also like, can we just take a second and look at that? Can you explain that again for me? Or can I tell you where I'm struggling here? And there's just a gift in that, because ultimately, you begin to feel more. You feel more spirituality. You feel more connection to this conversation that has endured for millennia. We keep hearing, just how this has been the glue of the Jewish people. Sure. And sometimes we don't actually see why. Why does it actually kind of hold us, keep us, connect us? So that's just a gift. It doesn't mean that he didn't sometimes frustrate me. And we should say that we disagree robustly on some things where we didn't end up changing each other's minds. But he also reminded me of what it means to actually say, you know what, you have something to say here. And it isn't like, oh my God, you don't think I'm like just a Reformed Jew who doesn't know anything. He was really saying, say that again. I want to hear it. You just made me look differently at this text that I've studied all my life.
Beautiful. And here and there also some sense of, everyone has a seat at the table in some ways,
Totally.
right? There's a sense of, and not only I have a right to be here, but also the opportunity, I won't even say the obligation, the opportunity to listen. Right,
Absolutely.
to be someone who's actually curious about the person you're with.
But your point also, I just would say, Justin, so many people have a barrier to this book, and I was there too.
Yeah.
It just seems just too daunting and too overwhelming, and there's no way I'll master it, and I don't know the Hebrew, and I don't know that this word also showed up 5 books later, and so I'm not even going to start it. And they hear it in synagogue. Someone is giving a drash that is including part of the Torah portion, but it's not the same as reading it for yourself, and particularly reading it with someone else.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah.
Rabbi Linzer.
Yeah.
What did you get from me?
I got an enormous amount. I would say, the key is what I mentioned earlier, that so much of my life had been text and conversation with other text, ideas and conversation with ideas. And Abby was constantly saying, how is this relevant to what's going on right now in the world? How is this relevant to the pandemic? How is it relevant to George Floyd? How is it relevant to the travel ban? The most I sometimes would sort of...
And so I would just say, how is it relevant to our lives?
our lives,
to our marriages, to our kids, to our friendships, to whether or not we volunteer.
Right. So in a certain way, the way this is a chavruta of two people that play different music, my chavrutas not only had been with almost always men, and men that shared 99% of my, or 99.9% of my worldview and commitments. So even though we had deep arguments, the chavruta model, the study partner model, it would go very, very deep, but also very, very narrow. This was a chavruta that pulled me out of my bubble and was someone played a very different type of music, and that made a huge difference. And I would say it parallels also the chavruta almost of the Torah. In a way, the Torah, for me, had been in chavruta with the Torah. It was always talking to other parts of the Torah. And now we were creating a different chavruta, having the Torah in conversation with the world, and the world in conversation with the Torah. And I think that really made a huge difference.
Beautiful. And I'll project onto you just from hearing the conversation, and I imagine as you go through the Torah this coming year and you get to these portions, I assume without even speaking, you'll have the other one in your head, right? When you get to Numbers, you're going to think about Num. So you have.
Is that going to be the takeaway?
No.
Oh my God.
Most definitely not. But I think that's a beautiful piece too, where sometimes we're left with our own head, right? And so to have someone who you've learned it with and be able to add their take. And I think that's a part of Jewish tradition in general, right? There's a famous story of Rabbi Soloveitchik talking about how when he walks into the classroom, it's not just him speaking with the students, that he brings all the voices of the generations before him. There's kind of this ongoing conversation with Nachmanides and Maimonides and all the people before him, and this idea they're all shaping the way we think. And now you guys have this, it's not that you read each other's books, you sat together, right, for over 2018 to 2020 and went through these parshas together, and you really have that other person in the back of your mind shaping it. That's beautiful. Okay, so I want to pick up again on what you said about loneliness post-October 7th, the challenges of post-October 7th, and I want to raise a different challenge, which brings us to next week's parsha, the parsha of Noah, or Noach in Hebrew. And so, there's this interesting conversation around Noach was a tzaddik, a righteous person in his generation. What does that mean? That means if he wasn't in a generation, he wouldn't be righteous. If he was an Abraham generation, he would be, like those kind of questions. And I think, another question that seems to be going on in this time, we had Alan Marinis, author of Everyday Holiness, on a few weeks ago, and his question that he brought was kind of, like, why be moral in an immoral world? And I think a question that I think a lot of people are struggling with October 7th is like how to think about what it means to be a good person today. And has the bar been lowered? There were these expectations that people had a minimum level of agreement with you, like, I don't know, Hamas is a terrorist organization. Hezbollah is a terrorist organization.
Massacre is bad.
Massacre is bad, right? Those kind of things. So, like, how are each of you thinking about this year? What does it mean to be a tzaddik in this generation? Where is that bar now, and how are you thinking through that question?
Don't start.
All right. So I think what's interesting with the way Genesis and then Noah come before Lech Lecha. Lech Lecha is the beginning of the Jewish story. God says to Abraham, go to the land I will show you, and that's the beginning of the Jewish story. But the Torah doesn't start with the Jewish story. It starts with the universal story. And in a way, the buildup is God is trying to have this message to all humans about living a moral life and a God-oriented life, but it keeps on failing, right? Right after Adam sins, and then sin and sin and sin. Let's start again with Noah, but then keep on sinning. And God sort of realizes we have to start with a more focused approach. We'll start with one person. We'll create this nation, the Jewish nation, and through them they will bring this message. It'll be more intimate, more personal, and through them they will bring this message to the larger world. And to some degree, the Torah really has holds these two ideas in tension, the universal and the particularistic. And I think that that's an area that we have really been grappling with post-October 7th. So many Jews have been involved in social justice causes and universal causes. Understand, the same way Moses would not tolerate injustice, whether it was to an Egyptian beating a Jew, or Jews against Jews, or the shepherds and the daughters of Jethro when they went to draw water from the well. He could not tolerate injustice, right? So that fighting for justice and against social injustice, that has been a major Jewish priority, certainly outside the Orthodox world. And now people are feeling completely abandoned, right? And all those people that weren't Jews that you thought you were shoulder to shoulder with and cared about these larger causes, where did they go? And I think we're rethinking that balance between universalism and particularism right now. How do we still care about larger world issues when the world turns against us, excuse me? How do we, in the Israel context, we just had October 7th. You, I'm sure, read the horrific stories about how people were celebrating on the anniversary of October 7th, not mourning, celebrating. So, and the Jewish tradition teaches, even when it's your enemy, the fall of your enemies, you shall not rejoice. The tradition about the angels would cry when God, remonstrated the angels when they wanted to sing when the Egyptians were being drowned. And so how do you hold the tragic loss of human life that is going on when we fight a necessary war of self-defense, right? Is it still possible to hold on to that other value at the same time? So I think that these are inherent questions. There's sort of two stories in the Torah, and we're grappling with how to navigate them right now.
Oh, beautiful. Before I turn to Abby, I just want to reflect on some of the things you said. One is it made me think of like that question of why are people celebrating? And I think, for me, very influenced by Holocaust experience, I'm always comparing to the Holocaust. It's making me realize how people thought about the way Jews were treated during the Holocaust before the war was over versus after. And maybe there was some celebration when it felt like we're doing a good thing, trying to kill Jews right now and trying to do genocide. And maybe there will be one day where if Israel is successful, whatever that means, no one knows what that means, where we can look back and hopefully people will agree that October 7th was a terrible day and not a good day. So I'm sitting with that. Yeah, so we'll see. And I think your question around universalism and particularism is core there. Abby, jump in.
I would just say, I'm going to go back to Breshit because B'Tselem Elohim, we're all made in the image of God, is something that I was raised with. Meaning... Say
one more. How you were raised with it?
That I had to be outer directed, not just inner directed, that I had a responsibility to other people.
Encounter every human as created in God's
Encounter every human, thank you, as having humanity, of being of equal worth.
Great.
And that's just kind of been my orientation from my parents, of a sense of responsibility and not necessarily just the kind of insularity of my own Jewish family. And I kind of thought it was reciprocal. And I sort of felt like that's to what Dov is talking about, that part of the shock. It's not just disappointment. It's really a sense of being stunned by the absence of shared humanity. And so when we get to the Noah story, I used to feel pretty disparaging of Noah because I felt like he was pretty selfish about just like, you're not really worried about anybody else. It's just like your family's saved.
Right.
And I still judge it on some level. Like when God says you're going to be the only ones who don't drown, you didn't really have an argument at all. You didn't protest. But there's also a new, it's not that I'm saying I don't care about anybody else, but this has been a year where I have to also say, if not for me, who? Like, if not for us, who? If we don't take care of our own family, it looks like nobody else is really taking care of us. And that's not actually a place I want to live, I will be honest with you. It is not a place I relish or have welcomed, and it feels like a little bit of a coarsening and a hardening of the heart. But that's where I'm sitting with Noah this year.
Beautiful, beautiful. It's really, it brings home this question of universalism, particularism, and I think we're seeing that. People are coming home a little bit more, or a lot more this year than in the past. I'll give you like a quick take for each of you. We talked a little bit about like the big picture of like what it was like to learn with each other. We mentioned the example of numbers, but I know Abby's expecting something a little bit more. Give me an example of one thing that comes to mind thinking back on this project where like it was flipped for you, where learning from the other person really like hit a nerve, and now like you were able to see it through that lens. Doesn't mean you 100% agree, but like something that really stands out about any portion in the Torah. Yeah.
Okay, I will go. And it was hukat, which is in Deuteronomy, and this idea that Moses is not going to get to see the promised land, not going to taste it, not going to touch it. That was just so kind of, I just rejected the idea, even though I was reading it and I know that it's true. Right. But I kept saying that there's so much injustice there. Moses he didn't sign up for this. He didn't actually want the job. And God taps him and says, you can handle it. And then there's so much resistance, and there's so much kvetching, and there's so much lack of gratitude in the people that he saves and leads. And it just felt unfair to me that he just doesn't get there.
Right.
And it was really Dov who said, sometimes we need new leaders to step aside and actually fully step aside. It doesn't even mean to go in with his people and let someone else take over, but actually not to even to not be part of it anymore. And I feel like that's something I've seen the world so differently now with that kind of torquing of thinking, because there's so many times I've thought someone held on too long in their leadership and didn't step aside when they should have and could have, and maybe real leadership is knowing when you're done.
Beautiful. Wow. I think Rabbi Avi Weiss, I've heard say that the true mark of success is not what you do when you're running the thing, but what it looks like after you're gone, or after you step aside, let's say. And that challenge of creating the space for someone to step in beautifully.
Really
I'm also thinking of many exampls that you're raising, but we'll stay out of that for now. Rabbi Linzer.
One that particularly comes to mind is Sota, the Parsha is Naso, which is in the beginning of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. There's Numbers again.
Yeah. No one is going to forget that Numbers is numbing. That'll be the big takeaway.
I resist it.
We came here to excite people about learning Torah this year. Pick up a book. Don't go to Numbers.
I want to say that one of the beautiful things, I'm going to digress for a second. One of the beautiful things about our learning, and it's really reflected in the book, is the fun that we have and is the warmth. And there's actually a line in the Talmud that the Torah should be a plaything. You should be playful and have fun and enjoy. It doesn't have to be so weighty and heavy. And I really hope that people are able to connect to that as well. One thing that really stands out is Shoftim, which is close to the end of the Torah. It's in Deuteronomy. And the mitzvah there, it speaks to a king. And it says that when a person becomes a king, he should have a Torah scroll written for him, and he should keep it by his side all the time. And it says, in order that he knows to fear the Lord his God. So I always understood that the purpose of that. So let me step back. So when we said, let's talk about this section, Abby said, I so love this section. It's about being a lifelong learner. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, it's right there in the text. Like, he should have it by his side. He should read from it all the days of his life. And I said, I always just assumed that was saying that no man is above the law. That even when you're the king and the supreme political authority, you have to remember that God is above you. But Abby said, okay, but it's about always being prepared to learn and recognize that there's more that we can find out and we don't have all the answers. And that really completely changed the way I look at that text. And I'd like to think that I have been a lifelong learner, but I think that this project has really made me a different type of a lifelong learner, and one that just is more open, engages more outside ideas, and thinks more about bringing the learning into the larger world around us.
Thank you for saying that, too. Yeah. I would just say that he became president of YCT while we were doing this, and one of the things that Shoftim also raised was this idea of whether real leaders keep learning. And he was talking about being open to the fact that even though he had the top job, he still was open to being taught.
I had the benefit of dating that job without having any training in that position. So
that's called humility.
So I took the position knowing that I did not have the answers, knowing that I needed help, and I think that's really made for a healthy and productive leadership.
You're a good king.
Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful. All right, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, really, to have both of you here. I'll say to our audience, certainly, it's the time of year. Pick what you're going to learn. Make sure you're learning something for the new year. We obviously recommend It Takes Two to Torah. It's a beautiful book. It's very accessible. There are light moments and heavy moments, and it's like serious and fun, and you can hear your voices speaking so beautifully. You can go to itakes2totorah.com if you want to get more resources as well. And may everyone be zoche. Maybe they have the merit, as they say, to find the right chavruta this year, to be able to find someone to study with, as you guys have, to get through the Torah, to learn all the different portions of it, and may we all, in a year that October 7th has taken so much of our attention away from Torah study, maybe this year can we, I heard someone call it the Simchat Torah Challenge. Can we find a way to enter into Torah and to learn from it? And the last thing I'll add is just if you, in addition to itakes2totorah.com, make sure you continue to check out Abby's show in the Spotlight every Monday evening, 8 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Pacific as well. And also, if you want to learn more about what Rabbi Linzer is doing, go to yctorah.org to learn about what the rabbinical seminary is doing and the way they're bringing Torah to the world. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.